Hello, welcome to Alamanda Textiles YouTube channel. In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make a shopping bag with an applique decoration. The first thing you will need to do is cut out your pieces of calico fabric for the main part of the bag. Using calico that is 95 centimeters wide, you're going to take a meter ruler and place the 45 centimeter mark on the cut edge and make 2 marks at 45 centimeters into the fabric. Then using tailor's chalk, you are going to rule all the way across the width of the fabric to create a line. You're then going to measure the handle. The handle is 12 centimeters in width. So what I am doing here is taking the 12 centimeter mark on my ruler and making 2 marks 12 centimeters further on than my initial mark, and then ruling straight across the width of the bag. So I now have 2 lines, one that is 45 centimeters into the bag and the other that is 12 centimeters. And then I am taking my scissors and I'm going to cut along these 2 lines to create my 2 pieces of fabric for my bag. The 45 centimeter piece will be the main part of my bag and the 12 centimeter piece is the handle. So moving the handle aside, I'm just going to fold that up neatly and put it to one side. I'm then going to take the larger part, which is the main part of the bag, and fold it in half. And then using my hands, or you could use an iron if you prefer, place a crease in the halfway mark. Then open that back out and cut that piece of fabric in half. When you have done this, you'll now have 2 45 by 45 centimeters squares, and we are going to use that to create the main part of our bag. The next step of the process is to design and create your applique. My design is a simple crescent moon, so I start out by drawing my crescent shape on a piece of paper using a grey lead or a pen, whatever you prefer, and then taking paper scissors, do not use fabric scissors for this, and cut out the shape of your applique on the paper. You can see I'm cutting really carefully around my crescent moon. Continue the process until you have cut all of it out. Next up, I need to cut out my crescent moon shape on my fabric. So I've brought my fabric over to my workstation and I am going to pin my crescent moon paper, my template, to the fabric in 2 or 3 places, as long as it's quite secure. And then you can take fabric scissors and carefully cut around the shape of your applique. You don't want to cut the paper when you do this, but you do want to cut right next to the paper so the shape of your fabric will end up the same shape as your applique design. Next up, you're going to remove the pins from your paper template, and now you have your piece of fabric for your applique. I take one of the pieces of calico that I previously cut for the outside of my bag, and now I'm going to use a glue stick, just a regular glue stick, to glue it in position on my bag. Now we use a glue stick for applique rather than pins because the pins can get in the way and they're also not quite secure enough. The glue stick will hold the fabric in place for about an hour up to a week, and you've got that time to get your applique sewn onto your bag rather than messing around with pins at this stage. Now over to the sewing machine, we need to use an applique setting to sew our applique on, and that is a zigzag stitch, which is the stitch number 12, and you are going to use a width of 3 and a length of 0.5. Make sure that you have those correct settings because we need to do a really tight zigzag around your applique so it doesn't fray. To start your applique, you want to match the colour thread to your fabric unless you want it to have a contrasting outline around the edge of your applique. I've decided that I want to match my thread, so I'm using a blue thread to help blend it in with the colour of my fabric. Now I'm starting right at the very edge of my applique, and as I am sewing around my crescent moon, I am sewing on the very, very edge of the fabric. So the zigzag stitch is just going over the edge of the fabric and onto the calico, and this will stop the fabric from fraying once you are using your bag later. If you sew inside your applique fabric, say 1/2 centimetre or 1 centimetre inside, you're going to have extra fabric on the other side of your zigzag stitch, and that's when your applique can start to fray and also start to look messy. So this is my finished applique of my crescent moon, and you can see just how close the zigzag stitch is to the edge of my fabric. So the next step is sewing the main part of the bag together. So taking my 2 pieces of calico for the main fabric, I'm now going to lay my applique right side up and place the other piece of calico on top of it. I'm lining up the edges really carefully and double checking that the applique is in between the 2 pieces of fabric. Now what's quite confusing about textiles sometimes is that you need to sew inside out, which means you have your right sides or the good sides of your fabric facing each other. Your applique is a good side of your fabric. The other piece doesn't have a right and a wrong side, so it doesn't matter which side that is facing in. Once you've lined up your 2 pieces of fabric, you can take pins and pin in each corner. Now I like to pin about 5 centimetres in from the corner. That means I can sew past the pins without danger of sewing over the needle and without having to remove the pins as I sew. So for this project, 5 centimetres in from the edge is a good distance. Then I'm taking my ruler, my metre ruler, and I'm going to draw on my seam allowance. The seam allowance is the distance between the edge of the fabric and where we sew. So for this project, it is 1.5 centimetres. So I'm measuring 1.5 centimetres in from the edge of the fabric in 2 places, then lining up those 2 marks and drawing my seam allowance on. And I do this for 3 sides of the fabric. Be careful here that you don't mark the top of your bag where it opens, because if you sew that shut, you won't have a bag that opens and you will need to use a seam ripper to unpick that if you do sew it closed by mistake. The sewing for this part of the bag is a regular straight stitch, so that is the stitch number 13 with a width of 0 and a length of 2.5. Right, so I'm putting my fabric in the sewing machine and putting the presser foot down, and I'm lining up my needle with my tailor's chalk marking. And just like all other seams, we do need to do the reverse stitch at the start and at the end of each seam. And just as a reminder, to do that, you need to push in the reverse button and put your foot down on the foot pedal at the same time. So you can see I'm doing that here. And I just reverse 2 or 3 stitches. Now turning my bag around, I am now going to sew the bottom seam. Again, I'm reverse stitching, and I am taking care that I stay on the line as I sew, and just checking that those pins aren't too close to the needle. I would remove them if they were too close, and I would risk running over them with the sewing needle. I then repeat this again for the 3rd seam. So now the sewing is complete, and you can see I have sewn down both sides and across the bottom of my bag, but I have not sewn across the top. It is now time to remove those pins and put them away safely. You should also now remove the excess thread that's hanging off the ends of your bag. So our next step is to make our handle. We start this process at the ironing board. Lay your piece of fabric out flat, and then I want you to fold it in half and use the iron to press that crease in at the halfway mark down the length of your handle. I'm using a hot iron for this because calico is 100% cotton fabric and it can withstand a very high heat. Next up, I open that piece of fabric back open, and you can see that there is a crease down the middle. I'm then taking the iron and I am folding over one edge towards the crease and using the iron to create another crease, a second crease in the handle. Now this edge shouldn't go over the original crease, it should just go next to it. So you can see that the original crease is still there. And then we repeat this again on the other side. So now we have 3 creases in the fabric, and I'm now going to fold over the fabric back to the original crease, which was down the middle. Now you'll note here that the two extra creases are lining up with each other. There are no raw edges of fabric in this process. Every side has either one fold or two folds in the fabric. Now the fabric is folded and ironed, I'm going to place a few pins in the handle about 15 centimeters apart, and this just holds the fabric in place while we sew it so it doesn't twist. Over to the sewing machine, you can see that I'm sewing this right near the very edge of the fabric. Now you can use the presser foot as a guide here of where to sew. So if you look carefully at your presser foot, you will see a little clear plastic window which attaches to a metal part on the right hand side. I am using that divide between the clear and the metal as my guide for where the edge of my fabric should be as I'm sewing. That ensures that I am the same distance from the edge of the fabric all the way along, and that I'm not too far in from the fabric, because if you sew too far in, it's going to have too much fabric on the outside, and if you sew too close to the edge of the fabric, you risk not catching both sides of the fold as you sew. You then repeat this process on the other side. The next step is to cut out and sew your lining. You can choose your lining from the fabric wall in the classroom, and I've chosen a colour that matches in with my applique. Because my applique is blue and white, I've chosen a blue colour for my lining. Now your lining needs to be exactly the same size as your outside part of your bag. So what I am doing here is I've laid out my fabric and I've popped my bag on top of the lining. I start by removing the lining piece that I need, and then using fabric scissors I am going to cut very carefully around the edge of my calico bag. And you can see that I'm right on the edge. I'm not adding extra fabric here, and I'm not trimming any off my bag. I'm just going to trim the lining fabric on the very edge of my calico fabric. This will ensure that they are the same size. So now you can remove your calico bag and put it away safely, and take your two pieces of lining fabric and you can start to pin these two together. So just like before, I'm putting my pins about 5 centimeters in from the edges on all four corners of my bag. And now I'm going to use ruler and tailor's chalk to mark where I am going to sew. This time I'm using white tailor's chalk, so it will show up on my bag. Now when you mark your tailor's chalk, you again are going to sew 3 sides of your bag, the 2 sides and the bottom of the bag. You do not sew the top. This is where the bag opens. Also, on the bottom of your bag, you need to make a mark about 10 centimeters wide where you are not going to sew. You will use this gap later to flip your bag around the right way. Back to the sewing machine, and again using a regular straight stitch, we are going to sew around those 3 edges of your lining, and remembering across the bottom edge of your lining, this is where you need to leave that 10 centimeter gap. Don't worry if you forget to leave that gap, you will just need to unpick it later. Now it's time to remove the pins and trim off the excess thread. In this next step, we're going to sew the handle to the bag. The first thing we need to do is turn the bag the right way around. Now when you do this, it's a good idea to point those corners out so the bag sits nice and flat. Then you're going to take some pins and the handle. Now open up the side seam of the bag and place the handle facing down. That way we've got the edges of the fabric all touching each other. Bring the handle around the front of the bag and line the other side of the handle up to the other seam on the other side of the bag. Now when you do this, you need to make sure that the handle has not got any twists in it, because if you sew a twist in place, that twist in the handle will be there to stay. Now while it looks like we're sewing the handle on upside down, when the bag is finished, it will actually look like this, going in the right direction. To sew the handle on the bag, you must first remove the flatbed attachment. This allows us to put the machine inside the bag, because the bag does have an opening, and it stops us from accidentally sewing the bag shut. Looking at this from the front, you can see I'm placing the machine inside the bag, popping the presser foot down, and now I'm able to sew over that handle and sew that in place without accidentally sewing the bag shut. Now to do this process, all I'm doing is just sewing from one side of the handle to another. This is a basting stitch, it's temporary. You do not need to back stitch this process. Once you've done one handle, turn the bag around and sew the other side. You need to remember to take your pins out before the next step. This is really important. So the next step is to sew the whole bag together. This is a really complicated part of the process. You may need extra help to get this section done. Please ask. We're going to start with the lining of your bag. Now your lining still needs to be inside out so you can see those seams. Lay it out in front of you with the opening facing you and open out the bag. Next up, we're going to take the calico bag and the handle, and this needs to be the right way around. So all the stitches are on the inside and the handle is on the outside facing down. Pick up the calico bag and fold it in half with the handle in the middle and place it inside the lining. Now this sounds really complicated and it looks like you'll never see your bag again. You need to trust me that when the bag is finished, everything will end up back on the outside. Now you've got your bag on the inside of your lining, you need to open the bag out inside the lining and line up all the edges of the bag. Now the handle should be inside facing down. Don't have it sticking out of the bag. If you do that, it'll end up inside the bag later on and you won't see the handle again. Start at the seams on the edges where the handle is and line up those two edges with each other and pop pins in place, holding them together. Next up, you're going to line up the rest of the edges of the fabric together. Now as I'm doing this, you can see I'm taking care to make sure the two edges, the lining edge and the calico edge, are completely lined up. You don't want one further down from the other or going over the top of the other one. They need to be right next to each other. Take a lot of care to get this right, and if you're unsure, come and ask for help. So now you can see I have all the edges lined up with each other. The handles are tucked inside and I have not pinned the bag together. It still needs to be open so your bag will work as a bag later. Back to the sewing machine. Again, I'm going to remove the flatbed attachment from the machine, and this is so I can put the machine inside the bag and it allows me to sew all the way around the opening of the bag in a loop. Now looking carefully at where I have the fabric lined up, I am using a 1.5 seam allowance for this part of the bag as well, but instead of drawing it on with tailor's chalk, we're going to use the line on the needle plate that says 15 millimeters is the same as 1.5 centimeters, and I'm lining up the edge of my fabric with that 15 line. As I sew around the bag, I'm going to follow along that line with the edge of the fabric. That will ensure that I sew straight and the correct distance from the edge. So as I sew, I do have these pins in place and I need to be really careful that I take them out, because if you sew over pins and the needle and the pin connect, it can break the needle. So I am going to stop the machine every time I come up to a pin, remove the pin and then keep sewing. Right, now I've reached the other side at the other seam. I'm going to flatten the fabric and then continue to sew over that seam. We want to keep sewing around in a circle or a loop, and we go all the way around until we get back to where we started from, removing the pins as we go. So now I'm back to the beginning. I'm going to sew over the bit that I started from and remember to do another reverse stitch to lock those stitches in place. So now your bag should look like this. It is still sealed shut and there's a seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters all around the opening of the bag. Alright, next up you get to turn your bag the right way around. Bring your bag over to a table, and that opening that you left in the lining earlier, you're going to now bring your bag through that gap all the way through. You need to keep bringing that fabric out. You'll also need to bring the lining out on itself. and you can start to see your bag reappear in this process. I'm poking the corners of the lining back inside the lining and flattening out the bag. So now you need to take the gap that you created earlier and grab some pins and pin it shut because you are going to sew this together. So again, it's important to line up the edges when you pin it together, ready for sewing, so then your gap will actually get sewn shut. Over to the sewing machine, and again we're using a straight stitch to sew this gap shut. We're going to place the presser foot down just before the gap, and then using the straight stitch and the reverse to start off that seam, take the first pin out, sew halfway across the gap, stop and remove the second pin, and then completely sew across the gap and doing another reverse stitch at the end of the gap to secure your stitches in place. Trim the threads off to finish your bag neatly. The next step, we need to put the lining back inside the bag. To do that, you open up the calico part of the bag and you just simply push the lining inside. You can use your hands to ensure that all the parts of the lining are pushed out into the corners of the calico bag as well. I like to give it a little shake just to help those corners settle into place. The last step is to give your bag a good iron. I like to iron around the top of the bag where I've just done the sewing and just all over the bag just to give it a nice, neat, presentable finish before I hand it in for assessment. So this completes all the steps of making your bag. You now get to enjoy your results. Well done! Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.